Public History Institute program of the term, and it's a continuation of the lecture series we have on the fight for civil rights, contesting discrimination in the American West. This is on Latino civil rights. So a couple of interesting talks described here, or at least with titles. And as I said before, Professor Akumi Garola of our department is speaking, and Professor Oliver Rosales of Bakersfield College Delano Center is speaking. So I will pass that along as well. And nice to see all of you today. And I'm glad you're here to take some notes as you listen to these research presentations by three outstanding students from the two sections of historical writing last semester. So it's an honor that they have been selected by their instructors to present today. And I think while you'll find their research topics interesting, and I hope pay attention to things we've talked about in the class, such as historiographical discussions, primary sources, use of evidence, and so on and so forth. I hope at the end of that you will have some questions in mind as you think about undertaking your own research projects going forward. So things you can maybe consider are, how did you land on that topic? How were you able to narrow that topic? Where did you find primary sources? What inspired you? Did you seek help from a professor? Did you use library reference people and so on? Okay, so during the talk, especially as you listen to the topics they're talking about, think about sort of those broader questions of the process and how they got going on it and what helped them create such a strong paper in the end. Okay, I don't know if you have an order, but I want to introduce them all first so that we can just go from one to the next. And Kayla Kiefer is graduating this term. She's also an officer in Phi Alpha Theta. And she is entering, she's applied to, and probably should hear if you haven't heard of her soon. In May, okay. To the CSUP History MA program. So we have another person headed that direction. As is Monique Flores. I have Monique in class this term. It's my pleasure to have her. She is also graduating this semester and also has applied to the CSUP MA program. A little bit of pattern here. Kayla, however, has been in the social science teacher preparation program as a degree program, and possibly could pursue that at some point. So if you have a master's, you might remember either Karen or Rudy saying from the graduate student panel in here that if you have a master's, you don't need a teaching credential as a separate certification, okay? And Monique is a traditional history major, which is a great route to go, regardless of what you decide to do with that degree. And Parker Coletti is graduating in the fall, come next fall, and is on the social science teacher preparation track. So he'll be getting into the credential program. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And they're going to have 15 minutes or so to give their presentations. Is that enough?
Oh, probably not.
Yours was over 20? Around 20?
Mine is about
15? Oh, yeah, you don't have 30
Mine's long.
Yeah, you don't have 30 minutes, so you'll have to, because we've got to leave time at the end for questions. I'll kind of try to monitor. And at this point, if everybody took 20 minutes, we'd have 5 minutes for questions. So that's not enough. So you'll have to be thinking. You go last.
So you want me to summarize? I could just.
Well, it's up to you, however you want to handle it, but you can either be looking through to cut discussions and say, I also talk about this point in the next couple of pages, but I'm going to move on to this really interesting. That's up to you. One of you like to go first? Okay, all right, let's start in the middle with Monique, and let me mute this. So you should be able to come over here and click on your download at the top. Any questions while Monique moves to the podium? Okay, everybody's doing great today? Actually, it was raining. I thought that was going to happen. Thank you. I'll wait on this. You can go ahead, Brian, when you're.
Oh.
Pass it down. Have you seen it already?
Yeah.
Oh, you guys have already seen it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, how do I do the full screen?
Oh, okay, I'll show you.
Where is it? Oh, okay.
Well, what I usually get is this, right here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just hit that and it'll give you the.
Okay. And then do I
And that's a slideshow, so from there, all you have to do is hit the arrow.
Oh, perfect.
And then it gets stuck, and then you have to do escape and go back and.
So, good late morning / afternoon to you all. My name is Monique Flores, and I would like to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today. I'm so excited to share my research project that I performed last semester. And I hope to give you insight about the research process and give insight so that you might be able to incorporate this information into your own academic endeavors that you will be undertaking. So I will do my best to maintain utmost transparency about my personal research process that I underwent this past semester, and I welcome any questions that you guys may have after this presentation. So to begin, I would like to present to you Frank Bernard and Sam Moline, Indians in America in Pre-Prohibition America. So we begin in the year 1917 with our individual, Francois Bernard, whom I shall refer to as Frank Bernard for the entirety of this presentation. Frank Bernard is a former French immigrant who came to America from the territory of the Haute-France region, which is bordering the French-Swiss borders. And he came to America in the late 1800s. So when he arrived to America, he made his way to Los Angeles. He had a brief stint in Bakersfield, and he kind of hopped around a little bit before making his way up to the Midwest, where he spent several years learning animal husbandry. So during his first trip is when he originally signed the citizenship certificate, making him a naturalized citizen of America. However, he did make a short return to his native country of France for about 1 year before he permanently returned to America with his new wife, Marie Pelisson. With his new family with him, he decided to make his permanent settling in Tehachapi. In Tehachapi, he became the proprietor of the Tehachapi Hotel. I showed an image of Tehachapi. This is the earliest image that I can find available to give you kind of an aerial view of the territory that I am responsible for explaining to you. So here I'm going to jump ahead to this image. This is the Tehachapi Hotel. Originally, he was the proprietor of the Tehachapi Hotel, and he later opened his own establishment, which it was in his possession until his death in 1940. The Tehachapi Hotel is sadly no longer in existence. It has burned down, but these are the earliest pictures I could find of it, and I thought it was fascinating, and I would like to share it with you all. However, we are going to get to the main issue of my paper, which is his arrest. He was arrested several times within the span of 3 months for the alleged crime of distributing alcohol to a Native American person. This will be our character, Sam Willie. So for his repeat violations, it was necessary for Bernard to pay a fine of $150 per incident, as well as receiving a 6-month alcohol distribution ban on his license. So that would total to about a little over $3,600 in our current days. So that would be the total of his fines. So here we arrive to the other character, Sam Loney. Little is known about Sam Loney aside from what has been reported in relation to this incident. It was only confirmed in several reports that he was someone of Native American / indigenous background, so that is the only really truly defined information that I have about him. So, according to the local reports, after receiving alcohol from Frank Bernard on at least one occasion, Samuel became belligerently drunk and made a public scene in the counselor with a rifle in hand and he later assaulted an individual. So he was obviously arrested. But what's truly interesting about Samuel's case is that even though it was immediately established that he was Native American, his own name was not known until 6 months into his own trial. So really what that says to us is that the defining, most important signifying thing of his character is that he is indigenous. His own tribe is also unknown, although based on the region of Tehachapi, I have been able to narrow it down to 2 tribes, the Yokuts and the Kauai'su, whom I shall return to later. What's truly, again, very interesting about this case is that the time period. This took place in 1917. For those of you who are more uninterested in American history, 1921 is the year in American history that alcohol was nationally banned from consumption, distribution, totally prohibited in the 18th Amendment. Yet this preceded that by 4 years. So it really brings up the historical question, what crime did they violate? What laws did they violate that led to their arrest? This is truly the point from which I began my research. So it can be looked at on the surface level as a potential legislative historical anomaly. But upon my findings, I find that it is not. So as early as the 1830s, laws regarding alcohol in relation to Native Americans and policing them had been established with the 1834 distillery ban, which means that Native Americans were not allowed to set up independent distilleries, the places where they would make the alcohol, on their privately owned land. This legislation was reaffirmed and expanded upon in 1915 with the 1915 legislation that was passed that outlined that not only were they not allowed to not make distilleries on their independent land, they were also now not allowed. It was prohibited for anyone to sell or furnish any alcohol to any Native Americans, whether they claimed full indigenous heritage, mixed indigenous heritage, or even someone who was loosely associated with the indigenous community. The way that they described it, the language they use, the word Indian, is so broadly used that it's difficult to know exactly who they meant to apply it to. But what's imperative for everyone to understand is that California itself was not an American state until 1850. So the largesse of laws that was being used in California were predominantly federal. There was no state or no local laws. It was not a state. So the 1834 distillery ban and the 1915 legislation was wholly encompassing in California. As I mentioned, the American government was already taking the liberties of policing California by 1834, yet they did not become a state until 1850. So this proceeds at least 16 years before they were ever a state. Upon the arrival of the 1850s, however, the majority of indigenous land was seized by the American government, and the Constitution of California was put into place, in which it was concretely determined that every white male citizen of the United States and every white male citizen of Mexico, that's the country that previously owns the land of California, was granted suffrage under Article 2, Section 1. This effectively denied individuals such as Samuel the rights of citizenship and suffrage, whereas naturalized citizens such as Frank Bernard would have been able to enjoy these privileges despite him not having been there, and with the assumption that Samuel himself was born there. In conjunction with the passage of federal laws that directly affected the indigenous demographic, there are several larger national and international factors that had an effect on this case to some degree. One of these events being the mass immigration of Europeans that took place starting from 1890 to about 1930. In the year 1914, a case study was done, and in the 5 years following 1914, it was estimated that a total of 1.8 million Europeans made their way to America. This is exemplified in the case of our very own Frank Bernard, who made his sojourn to America during this time period. This mass influx of European immigrants can be attributed to a number of factors, but an outstanding one is the passage of World War I. America's economy, as a result of the previous industrialization era, was booming following the war, and this drew the attention of many who sought out the economic opportunities that they felt that they could venture into in America. An additional factor that played a role was manifest destiny. This is the 19th century ideology that emphasized the need for the push towards Western expansion and settlements, leading to the establishment of what we could call American-centric communities in California and other Western states that were predominantly spearheaded by Anglo-American settlers. Here we again arrive to Tehachapi, a rich indigenous historical area with the Yokuts, who were regarded as peaceful and generally unified, although less distinctive and not as influential, which differs from the predominant indigenous group of the area, the Kwaisu, for which the Tehachapi name is derived from. These Native American tribes pushed back against the Anglo-white settlers that came to encroach upon their territories. Yet, as we all know, these tribes were ultimately subdued, and they fell under the laws of the American government. Their original moral values, their lifestyles were completely replaced with more American sentiments. It is with this knowledge that we must approach the case of Sam Emily and Frank Bernard so that their potential connection can be better understood. I want to tell you guys that how this pertains to you, because I know that this is kind of overwhelming just to go over in one session. This is not an overnight project. This is months and months of hard work, and not work I performed on my own. I'm so glad that Donato is here today because he is one of the main contributors to my research process, and I don't think I could have written such a good paper without him there. I want you guys to know that the primary sources that led me to this case were found here at CSUP in the Historical Research Center. You guys do not have to go scanning the internet for one singular storyline. You can find it you can just walk 10 minutes over there and you guys might find it. So I want you guys to know that it's within your reach. It is completely possible to write this story. This story has never been told before, but it is your responsibility and your duty as developing historians to find these storylines, to find the necessary historical evidence to tell these narratives, because you are responsible for setting the tone for these. But that does not mean you need to be omniscient. I sadly am not. So to kind of come back to the story of Frank Bernard and Sam Emily, I can say with confidence, I have no idea what happened to their relationship after they served their sentences. There is no historical evidence that even could be used to make a claim that they were best friends or that they stayed in contact with each other, or that even Sam Emily was the only Native American individual that Frank Bernard distributed alcohol to. Yet I think it is extremely valuable, extremely more valuable to instead be able to come across individuals who cross paths seemingly at a random time in history, and to be able to place them on a historical timeline and to make a historical analysis based not only on the events that are happening in their local world, but in the broader expanse. It is necessary for you guys to know what is happening in the world at this time, what is happening in your country at this time, what are these social implications of this time. We know at this time, based on what we've found, that there was prejudice potentially against European immigrants whom many Anglo-American settlers claimed that they did not have, that there was a distaste for. And we know that there was prejudice against Native Americans who were subjugated under the American government, and they had their private land stolen from them. Scholars such as Albert M. Codemio, Arwin D. Smallwood, and Matt Garcia kind of attempt to analyze this point of minority groups forming connections in seemingly random ways in the face of shared oppression. This is it is so important for you guys to find authors who share at least some narrative sameness as you guys. Although I feel that the story of Frank Bernard and Sam Lee should not be reduced to that of only oppression, it is important to completely acknowledge this factor and this part of their history in order to accurately place them in a historical perspective. So with that, I would like to share some of the images of the documents I found. This is the original certificate of citizenship that Frank Bernard signed in December 19th of 1889. This is the original document in which it listed his arrest, as well as the fine that was necessary for him to pay. And I would like to share the images of the Oclip that I was able to find in books that Donato was able to share with me from the Historical Research Center. I think it is important for you guys to have an idea of a face to put to this name, Sam Lee. Although it's not him, these are potentially his people. These are the Kauai Sioux. So again, know who your characters are. Know the world that your characters are living in. Ask basic questions. It is okay to ask who, when, where, what, and why. These will lead you to much deeper, more intricate historical questions. And then find what are the challenges to your scholarship. As I already stated, I have no idea what the relationship between them was, and I can't make an accurate allegation against their relationship or towards their relationship or a criticism of it because I have no defining knowledge. Again, know the scholars out there. They will be so helpful to you in providing an idea and adding to your narrative if you read their work and can kind of see the main points and comparisons that you can draw between your own story. And to have diverse sources. These are my sources. They're about 18 to 20 in total. If I were you, I would not have less than 18. It is so important for you to have a diverse list to go from, and some of the best pieces of sources that I have found have been in legislation because they are well-documented pieces of history. So with that, I would like to say thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today. I hope you guys enjoyed my presentation, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Monique. And she reminded me that I am remiss in not introducing Donato Cruz from the library, who works in the Historical Research Center, is an incredible asset to the library, to the history program, went through our MA program, wrote a thesis that has now been cited by the California legislature on redlining. And he and Chris Livingston, whom you met at the Historical Research Center at the beginning of the term, are giving a talk at Bakersfield College. Is it in the Levin Center?
Yes.
Monday evening. And if you want more information about details, what time is it? 6?
It's from 6 to 7:30.
6 to 7:30, Monday evening at Bakersfield College in the Levin Center. So on redlining, you might find that interesting. Okay, let's go now with Kayla and her very interesting topic.
I don't have as much to say as Monique. I'm going to be reading my paper more directly and just have my slides for you to have something to look at. I wrote this paper last spring semester with Professor Freeland, and it's titled California Higher Education is Predisposed, Ronald Reagan, and Conservatism. Here I just have a breakdown of the contents of my paper. All of this is specific to my paper, but in your introduction, you're always going to want to have a hook, some context, and your thesis, and it should always end with your thesis at the very end. So with that, I'm going to begin reading from my paper. If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement, remarked Governor Ronald Reagan regarding student protests occurring at the University of California, Berkeley in April 1970. Governor Reagan later revoked his statements, claiming it was a figure of speech. Although this bloodbath occurred, Reagan's words had a significant impact on higher education in California throughout his terms in office. Student protests for civil rights, freedom of speech, and against the Vietnam War were prevalent on the UC Berkeley campus throughout the 1960s and 70s. Reagan was beginning his political career and utilized the UC Berkeley protest as a part of his gubernatorial campaigns in California to gain conservative support throughout the state. After becoming governor, Reagan was quick to act and began attacking the structure and budget for higher education within the state, despite the massive contradictory nature between his actions and his beliefs. Reagan's reactions and rhetoric towards student protests occurring at UC Berkeley throughout his 1966 California gubernatorial campaign resulted in negative conservative attitudes towards higher education when he became governor. Within his first year as governor, Reagan utilized the negative conservative attitudes towards higher education to implement legislation and policies that decreased the accessibility and efficacy of higher education in California, which established a precedent for the rest of his term as governor. Doing so improved his approval rating as governor, but resulted in long-term negative conservative attitudes toward higher education and worsened conditions for students and employees within higher education. Here I have a video of Reagan explaining how that statement was a figure of speech.
Actually, what I used as an expression or a figure of speech was saying that I believe that certain administrators so far had attempted to temporize to the point of appeasing in an effort to deal with this obviously little revolutionary group. And I said, I think that they've come to the end of the line of temporizing. I said, I think they've come to the moment of truth. They must bite the bullet and take the bloodbath of saying here, this far and no farther. It was an expression of speech.
I don't know about you guys, but that explanation did not make very much sense to me. Moving on. To better understand the impact Reagan had on the nature of higher education in California, it's necessary to understand the nature of higher education in California before Reagan. The establishment of the University in California in 1868 originated out of separate state, private, and federal efforts to establish a college in California. Here I have listed off the timeline of the major events that resulted in the establishment of public colleges in California. First with the Constitutional Convention, then in the California Constitution, then Congress granted to the state of California 46,000 acres of land to establish learning institutions. Then a private college in California was created in Oakland, but later on in 1868, the College of California had a very limited budget and they could no longer afford to keep it open, so they donated their campus to the state, and the University of California was created using that campus. In regard to the nature of an institution, the Organic Act passed in 1868 that created the University of California stated that the University of California was intended to provide instruction in a broad array of subjects and professional pursuits, to provide free admission and tuition to California residents once affordable, and to be self-governing. In 1879, the California Constitution was altered to incorporate Article 9 regarding education. Section 9 of the article declared the UC as a branch of the state's government and granted the regents of the university, quote, full powers of organization and government, subject only to such legislative control as may be necessary to ensure the security of its funds and compliance with the terms of the endowments of the university, end quote. The same section also states that the university, quote, shall be entirely independent of all political or sectarian influence. Throughout the end of the 19th and 20th century, the CSU system, and the community college system established multiple campuses with public support and experienced a significant increase of students. California residents received free tuition and began to pay minimum fees in the early 20th century, while out-of-state students paid for tuition and fees. Significant change regarding the structure of higher education in California did not occur until 1960 with the passage of the Donahoe Higher Education Act, also known as the California Master Plan for Higher Education. The plan was spearheaded by both Bakersfield Assembly member Dorothy Donahoe and developed by the current UC President Clark Kerr. Major aspects of the act are as follows: differentiation in access and accessibility between the UC, CSUs, and community colleges. So the UC was intended to be a research institution, while CSUs are more for students to receive their degrees with less research focus, and then community colleges are specifically to enable access for students who may not meet the requirements to be enrolled in a UC or CSU. They were also, community college students were also guaranteed priority admission to UC or CSUs. It reaffirmed the principle of free tuition for California residents, but shifted responsibility for auxiliary costs to students and faculty, and it established the Cal Grant program for needy and high-performing students. Unfortunately, as I noted on here, Assembly Mount Hope died 2 days before the plan was officially signed into law. The plan was successfully implemented with the support of the government and the public on April 6, 1960. Unfortunately, supporters' attitudes from Californians towards higher education drastically shifted by the end of the decade due to widespread student protests and counterculture that emerged from the UC Berkeley campus. Student activism was not uncommon at the campus of UC Berkeley by the fall of 1964. However, after students began soliciting donations in support of the civil rights movement, led by African Americans, the Chancellor of UC Berkeley decided to revoke the previously established free speech area on campus on September 14, 1964, and thus began enforcing a previously unenforced rule that prohibited students from engaging in political advocacy on campus. UC President Kirk was out of the country when the free speech area was revoked, yet when he returned, he acknowledged that it was a mistake and ordered it be reestablished. Unfortunately, he did not enforce his decision because he focused on the work he missed while he was out of the country, a decision that he later stated was he regretted. Despite warnings from administration, students continued to engage in activism on campus because they considered the administration's prohibition as an infringement on their right to free speech, and also as a method to prevent the civil rights movement from growing and gaining support from students. On October 1st, 1964, students set up multiple civil rights tables in prominent locations around campus and quickly experienced confrontation with the deans of UC Berkeley and the campus police lieutenant. After student activists asserted that they did not intend to leave the campus nor take down their table, the police lieutenant attempted to arrest the student. Much to their surprise, though, the students in the surrounding area began to chant "Fail, be arrested too," and began to sit down around the police car to prevent it from moving. The sit-in continued into the evening and attracted thousands of students. Initially, administrators refused to negotiate with the students. However, by the early evening of October 2nd, President Kerr began negotiations with the students and agreed to not press charges against the student placed in the police car, and the sit-in ended following Kerr's interference. So here we have the student that was being arrested, Jack Weinberg, sitting inside the police cruiser, and that is Mario Savio talking on top of the police cruiser, and he was one of the leaders who would originally set up the tables that they were being told to take down. A few weeks later, students that led the movement received letters ordering them to appear before a campus disciplinary committee for their involvement. Students responded by orchestrating another overnight campus protest on December 2nd, 1964. However, unlike the first protest, students were met with massive arrests ordered by the California governor, Edmund Pat Brown, that resulted in the arrest of 800 students, an unprecedented use of power against students. Students responded with another protest the next day that formed into a 3-day strike with support from a large majority of the student population. Faculty were sympathetic to their cause and voted through their academic senate on December 8, 1964, to not pursue disciplinary action with the leaders of the movement, stated that methods for protesting are subject to reasonable regulation, and agreed that, quote, the content of speech or advocacy should not be restricted by the university, and concluded that future disciplinary measures for political activity shall be determined by a committee appointed by the academic senate. Although the issue was resolved, in an appearance in January 1965, Ronald Reagan stated that he approved of the arrest of the student protesters. Ronald Reagan is best known as a conservative, charming, tough-on-crime Republican that served as the 40th president of the United States from 1980 to 1989. However, before Reagan's rise as a politician, he was a working-class liberal from a small town in Illinois. Reagan's economic conservatism likely initially developed as a response to his experience as an 18-year-old when the Great Depression began in 1929. After Reagan graduated from college in 1932 with a degree in enter the workforce and face the struggling economic conditions of the period. For the first 4 elections that Reagan was old enough to vote in, he voted for Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Reagan's charm with audiences can be traced to his success as a sports announcer and later as an actor in Hollywood until 1965, after starring in his first film in 1937. During his time as an actor, Reagan was a member and served as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, the labor union for entertainers, and served 7 one-year terms as the president from 1947 to 1952 and 1 year in 1959. Reagan experienced a particular time in Hollywood's history as the fear of communism swept the United States throughout the 1940s and 1950s with the Second World Scare. Hollywood actors became targets of accusations and risked being blacklisted within the industry. As a staunch supporter of democracy, Reagan was against the spread of communism and refused to work for communists in Hollywood. As the anti-communist movement continued to grow and plague Hollywood, Reagan's personal beliefs began to shift further and further to the right, as he grew to believe liberals were not harsh enough against communists. Reagan's political shift to republicanism also coincided with the growth of his personal wealth, as he began to view politics from the perspective of the wealthy rather than the working class. He became focused on the harmful nature of big government and high tax rates. In 1962, Reagan left the Democratic Party and in 1964 became the co-chair of Republican Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign. Although Goldwater ultimately lost the election to Democrat incumbent Lyndon B. Johnson, Goldwater's campaign provided a platform for Reagan to enter the political sphere as a political figure. On October 27, 1964, Reagan gave a televised speech on behalf of Goldwater at the request of Republican Party officials now known as the Time for Choosing, in which Reagan criticized the spending habits for social programs and the size of the federal government, criticized the Democratic Party for their handling of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and endorsed Goldwater for president. Following Reagan's speech, monetary donations to the Republican Party and its candidates increased, and Republican Party officials noted Reagan's success and targeted him to become a candidate in the 1966 California gubernatorial election. I have a speech here, but due to time constraints, I cannot play it. Reagan formally announced his campaign for governor in his address, A Plan for Action, on January 4th, 1966, in which his rhetoric and attention towards student protesters, faculty, and administration at UC Berkeley for his campaign began. By directing attention to the student protests, Reagan also aimed to direct attention to what he viewed as larger issues present within the state, primarily in regard to the budget and leadership. In his address, Reagan's only mention of the university described the great nature of higher education in California and emphasized that high tax rates were imposed upon Californians to fund the establishment of the UC before chastising students and faculty at the university for their disrespect. So here I have that quote here, which states, "Or do we no longer think it necessary to teach self-respect, self-discipline, and respect for law and order? Will we allow a great university to be brought to its knees by a noisy, dissident minority? Will we meet their neurotic vulgarities with vacillation and weakness? Or will we tell those entrusted with administering the university we expect them to enforce a code based on decency, common sense, and dedication to the high and noble purpose of the university?" Interestingly, Reagan makes the events unfolding at UC Berkeley appear as a significant issue, but contradicts himself in stating that it was only the actions of the minority that were causing problems. Events that occurred at UC Berkeley in March 1966 provided further fuel for Reagan to utilize in the campaign speech to instill fear among his listeners, but also insert himself as their savior that could provide law and order for the state. Reagan described the dance as so. This is a quote from a book that he had written that contains the manuscript for the speech. So this isn't exactly how he actually presented it. I also wanted to play that, but I don't have enough time. So in the manuscript, he states that for the dance, the hall was entirely dark except for the light from 2 movie screens. On these screens, the nude torsos of men and women were portrayed from time to time in suggestive positions and movements. 3 rock and roll bands played simultaneously. The smell of marijuana was thick throughout the hall. There were signs that some of those present had taken dope. There were indications of other happenings that cannot be mentioned here. speech and continued stating that taxpayers deserve to know that both students and faculty members involved are harshly punished and that the campus be, quote, cleaned up. Reagan's attack was not solely focused on punishing the students. Rather, he ensured to emphasize that the leadership at UC Berkeley were at significant fault for the students' actions and deserve a just punishment. However, within the speech, Reagan contradicted himself again as he claims that there was a large leadership, morality, and decency gap present at UC Berkeley that was seemingly only caused by a, quote, small minority of beatniks and filthy speech advocates. Nevertheless, Reagan concluded his speech stating that he urged the California legislature to hold public hearings regarding charges from the House of Un-American activities about communist and sexual misbehavior on campus, instilling anti-communist fears and again highlighting himself as the savior of democracy and morality. Reagan further utilized his opponent Pat Brown's support for the university and its leadership to demonstrate himself as the superior candidate that could provide proper leadership for the state. Reagan succeeded in this regard because he directed so much attention to the events unfolding at UC Berkeley. Although the public expressed disapproval towards the events at UC Berkeley, Reagan's excessive attention towards the protests instilled in his audience that it was an issue that required further attention and action. A member of Reagan's campaign team recalled that after Reagan escalated the topic into an issue, it began to appear in the polls. Contrastingly, Pat Brown did not direct attention to the protest because he trusted the UC and UC President Clark Kerr, but at the same time it ended up reflecting poorly on him because he didn't direct as much attention to the protest as Reagan did. Furthermore, Reagan accused Brown of violating Article 9 in the California Constitution that stated that the UC would be free of all political or sectarian influence, and cited his involvement with UC personnel. Although Reagan himself was in communication with multiple members of the UC Board of Regents that expressed their support for his campaign. Despite Reagan's contradictory nature, he prevailed against Brown with a 58% majority vote on November 8, 1966. I'm not sure why the colors are flipped in the website that had this, that has a voting map, but Reagan is the blue and Pat Brown is the red.
Kayla, about a minute and a half.
Okay, so Reagan was sworn in as California's 33rd governor on January 2nd, 1967, and acted against higher education quickly. The budget Reagan inherited for the state was in a deficit, thus he planned to reduce state spending in all areas by 10% and raise taxes. On January 6th, he announced a plan to cut the state budget for higher education, and the following year suggested California residents pay tuition for the first time. So here we have the top half are the fees that students already paid. They were just incidental fees, but Reagan proposed that they pay already double what they were paying, or more than double than what they were already paying. So they'd be paying that $200 on top of the $135 and $400 on top of the $275. Reagan said that tuition might affect those who are there really not to study but to agitate. It might make them think twice about paying a fee for the privilege of carrying a picket sign. The UC Board of Regents ended up voting against that measure, although they did agree to allow an additional fee charge with no specific limit. Although tuition wasn't imposed that year, state funding towards higher education was still cut. The governor of California serves as an ex officio member of the UC Board of Regents, so they're granted a position on the board and have voting power because they're governor. On January 20th, 1967, due to pressure, the UC Board of Regents ended up voting to dismiss President Kerr from his position as UC president after 8 years. His removal was viewed as unjust and was demonstrated by negative reactions from the educational community.
Kayla, we're out of time.
Can I just get to my conclusion?
Yep.
Well, then there was another protest for a park, and Reagan ended up deploying the National Guard and using tear gas against them, and then a couple months later, when 4 students in Ohio were killed by the National Guard were there, he closed all UC and CSU campuses for 4 days. He did support teachers did not support collective bargaining for all public teachers because he didn't want strikes in education. Then when he ran for president, he used his experience as California governor to bolster his support for his campaign.
I think we're gonna have to stop because we still have Parker and we're running out of time. So, in one sentence, do you wanna restate your thesis or?
My
Yeah.
conclusion was really long.
That's okay.
The point of this to me was that education is really powerful, and although education is not for everybody, it's important for it to be accessible to everybody.
Okay, well, let's stop there and we can ask questions maybe afterwards if there's time.
These
Okay.
are just student debt stories that I found online when I was writing my paper, and this is a breakdown of the expenses for a friend of mine that goes to UC Irvine. One year he's in $44,000 of debt. These are my sources. These are my sources for the presentation.
All right, thank you. Parker, you've mentioned the possibility of just explaining your paper as opposed to reading, since you said it would be a half an hour if you read it. So I think given the constraints of time, we have limited timeline.
Okay. Yeah.
If you can do it in less than 20, that would be awesome. If you can do it in 15, that would be even more amazing.
I'll just summarize and hit on some main points. Similar to Kayla's paper, mine is on counterculture in 1960s California. I'm going to read my introduction paragraph because I know you guys are learning papers. So, on February 10th, 1964, rising folk rock legend Bob Dylan released The Times They Are Changing, which quickly became the anthem of the 1960s from that point onward. Many historians, documentarians, and scholars use this song to describe the 1960s, but it is more than a mere cliche. Not mentioning The Times They Are Changing would be a colossal misstep in covering the 1960s because the lyrics read like a true statement written by somebody who understands the youth and the emerging counterculture movement. Drenched in socio-political commentary, the song and Dylan align themselves with anti-war protesters, the civil rights movement, the hippie movement, and the overall emerging counterculture movement of the 1960s. On February 22nd, 1964, 12 days after releasing the counterculture anthem, Bob Dylan performed at University of California, Berkeley. UC Berkeley became the hub for counterculture expression during the 1960s in the state of California. Bob Dylan exclaimed to the crowd of hippie youth that times are changing and the world will leave those behind who do not catch up. From members of Congress and senators to mothers and fathers, the 1960s counterculture would be a global movement where Californians were unique in their contribution. And then my thesis is California's youth was protesting at college campuses, demanding peace in Vietnam, protesting for civil rights, spreading the message of peace, love, and acceptance, all the while partaking in the diversities of the 1960s counterculture, while drawing attention to these social issues on a nationwide scale and facing adversity from campus administration, police, politicians, and news reporters. So after my introduction, I go into a little bit of a background on American politics with the Red Scare and how communism was enemy number one in many minds. And then talk a little bit about the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was a committee that was, the purpose was to investigate anybody who had suspicions of being tied to communists or being a communist sympathizer. And the problem with HUAC is that anything really could be labeled. It was a broad term, and it could ruin people's careers. There's the, I think it's the Hollywood 10s, if anybody knows, correct me if I'm wrong, but they were investigated by HUAC, and a lot of those people were blacklisted from Hollywood. So go into a little bit of that just to give good background and give the reader some a basis to go into the paper. And then I talk about how Berkeley students protested a HUAC investigation at the San Francisco City Hall that was investigating some left-leaning newspapers. And the newspapers, some of them employed Berkeley students, so that kind of enraged people on campus. And then protesters showed up, and I wish I would have made a presentation. I can write a paper, but I can't make a presentation.
It's fine, Parker, it's totally fine. Share your paper as is, absolutely.
So once the protesters were at the city hall, police escalated the situation with the protesters. They began to hose them down, I think it's like a 38 flight of stairs, and dragging them downstairs. And this was all filmed by several news outlets in San Francisco. And then HUAC bought the rights to several of the footage, much of the footage, and released a film called Operation Abolition. And I go into that a little bit, which frightened conservative adults because it painted UC Berkeley as a campus that was fostering communism, that the students were going to destroy America, and then the liberal youth of America really enjoyed the film. They thought it was very interesting. It was showed at several college campuses, and kids showed up and protested against the showing of the film because of how demonizing how bad and poorly it painted colleges, or Berkeley students in particular. And so people from all over America started moving to California because liberal youth became excited that they saw more and more people with similar ideals to themselves. And then I talk a little bit about some hotel sit-ins that echoed what was going on in the South. One in particular was the 1963 Sheraton Palace hotel sit-in, which the Berkeley protesters caused such a ruckus that it actually got some legitimate change in the hotel industry. The protesters were protesting against discriminatory hiring practices, and once causing such a ruckus, hotel industry statewide passed anti-discrimination laws and opened employment on all levels for minorities, which really exciting, and the real-world change empowered the Berkeley students while bringing ire to campus faculty. As Kayla had mentioned, UC Berkeley's administration started revoking certain places that were common for students to gather and discuss off-campus issues. And Rule 17, which was a rule that prohibited political and religious speech on campus. That was, as Kayla had mentioned, lightly enforced on college campuses, but following the Sheraton Palace sit-in, administration really started cracking down, and they removed some chairs and tables on a certain portion of the campus that was known to students gather there and talk about off-campus issues, as they put it. And then I go into a little bit about the free speech movement, which was a movement spearheaded to allow college students the right to protest on campus and talk about off-campus issues and just let their voices be heard. And then a big portion of my paper is talking about the negative press that student protesters received and that eventual hippies received. I'd like to read a quote. Max Rafferty, the California State Superintendent of Public Instruction from 1963 to 1971, at a press conference about the Berkeley protesters, described the students as bearded, unwashed characters with sandals and long hair who would usually be regarded as lunatic fringe with which you put up with, but in effect, the campus had been turned over to these characters. Now, I like to highlight Rafferty's words because it begins to show and highlight how there is a weaponization of language against people who, at this point, were speaking out against what was very common in America. And that goes into Ronald Reagan also using weaponizing language against Berkeley protesters to try to dumb down and delegitimize what they stood for. Forgive me. Once the physical involvement in Vietnam started, Berkeley protesters started going against the Vietnam War, founding the Vietnam Day Committee, which was an excuse me. Yeah, the Vietnam Day Committee of 1965 was to march and hold rallies against America's presence in Vietnam. The anti-war sentiments were so strong that even Berkeley high school students held discussions of growing anti-war sentiments on campus and debates about social issues facing America. Now, this is very important because it shows how powerful the youth can be, how powerful we can be. And that's what really made me want to write this paper, was sometimes you feel a little bit powerless. And I wanted to write this to show myself that we can be change in America, and really wanted to show that people our age can make some real world change. So besides the Vietnam Day Committee, there's also the Stop the Draft Week, which was a protest in San Francisco that went against that was outside the Oakland Draft Induction Center, where an estimated 10,000 protesters gathered and burned their draft cards, which at this point was not illegal. The following year, in May, the Supreme Court ruled that burning a draft card was illegal. So these protesters burned their draft cards. Press was there. The police showed up and escalated tensions. The police showed up in like shields, helmets, and like batons. You know, they're just kids. And I wish I would have made the presentation because some of the pictures from that day were pretty incredible. And then I go into a little bit about the hippies, and I talk about the Summer of Love. In July 1967, approximately 100,000 hippies rushed a 25-block district in San Francisco called Haight-Ashbury. There's a lot of great news footage of the gathering. Viewers can see hippies dancing, singing, wearing Eastern culture-inspired clothing, and coming together to voice their opinion on Vietnam. At the same time, the rock band, the Beatles had released their 8th studio album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which became an anthem for the hippies in particular, because it was catchy, psychedelic pop rock, and expressed many of the central ideas for the hippies. A sense of friendship, love, and community, with the lyrics of "with a little help from my friends," feeling disconnected from an older generation of "she's leaving home," or the spiritual masterpiece of "Within You, Without You," that beckons the listener to turn inward and analyze their soul. The album dominated the radio. It was in record stores. It was on television. The Beatles did a live broadcast to approximately 400 million viewers in over 26 countries for the song "All You Need Is Love," with a very psychedelic and hippie-inspired set that was viewed by a lot of people. I think at that point that was the most viewed live broadcast. Anyway, no matter how inspiring the Summer of Love may have been, there's plenty of negative attention, even from those within the counterculture movement. When reflecting on the summer of '67, George Harrison of the Beatles recalled the scene in San Francisco. He said, "But it was full of horrible, spotty, dropout kids on drugs, and it turned me right off the whole scene. I could only describe it as being like the Bowery, which is an impoverished area with unhoused people. Lots of bums and dropouts, many of them very young kids who dropped acid and come all over from America to this mecca of LSD." And I really wanted to highlight his quote in particular because he was spearheading much of the pop culture aspect of the hippie movement was spreading the ideas that they stood for, and yet when reflecting on his contribution or reflecting on what the hippies stood for, he kind of denounced it. Even though that this was several years later, it still shows that there is a bit of disconnect between the hippies and what they stood for versus what they were actually doing, which what they were actually doing was a lot of drugs. But so I really wanted to highlight that just because it does show that no matter how potent an idea can be, there could be some, maybe you could call them some bad faith actors within a movement that might, And then I talk about some politicians, Ronald Reagan, in the morality gap speech, funny enough. Ronald Reagan demonizingly describes the youth as beatniks, radicals, and filthy speech advocates. And the filthy speech advocates is interesting because that's a play on the free speech movement. So he's kind of co-opting it and making it mean something else. And he describes the Berkeley campus as a rallying point for communists who dance provocatively to psychedelic rock music and parties put on by the Vietnam Day Committee. Ronald Reagan hits on 3 conservative talking points to trigger distrust, disdain, and contempt for the Berkeley students. They are communists, they hate America, and they're perverts of rock music and drugs. And then I also, when writing so I like to use several different kinds of types of sources. For this in particular, I used some songs, some albums. You never know where you're going to get some good stuff. That George Harrison quote came from a documentary that Martin Scorsese had done, so you never know where you're going to end up finding something that's very useful. There's a thing on the library, I forgot what it's called, it's full of great resources. I wish I knew it, I wish I remembered what it's called, I just butchered that. Yeah. That's about it.
Okay, I'm hoping that you've thought of a few questions that you might like to ask about their projects, and we can start with Lily.
I'm just curious, what drew you guys to particular topics? Did you just kind of like stumble upon an interesting story, or was there something else that interested you?
Yeah, I'll go. I think I mentioned in my speech, I went with my historical writing class to the History of the Center, and Donato and Dr. Livingston provided us with a multitude of documents to go through, and when I was looking through just this past summer, I believe Dr. Livingston acquired thousands of court documents that were going to be thrown away, but Dr. Livingston and Donato saved them and brought them to the Historical Research Center, and that's where I found the document entailing Frank Bernard's original arrest. And when I saw it, I just thought, wow, this is so interesting, because I immediately started thinking of the other world events that were going on around there. But I will say it was not my first topic idea, and it was just the one that I felt that I could do the most justice to.
In my class we had us write down multiple topics we were interested in, and for one of mine it was just higher education. Our theme for the course was health and history. So one of them was higher education, and then another one was conservatism and Ronald Reagan, and then I realized I could easily combine the two because of how much they coincide.
For me, it's just a topic that's always interested me, the intersection between music and history. So this was kind of a passion project for myself. If any of you take Dr. Allen, he'll say research is me search. So this was kind of for myself, but yeah, that's about it.
Awesome.
This started mostly towards Monique. What about, how did you go about researching very, in a way, random people that don't have a lot of historical significance on a larger scale?
So that's a really funny story. I must have spent several hours in the Historical Research Center. Donata was there with me, the other aides that work in the Historical Research Center. One of them is a classmate of mine, Samuel. They compiled information that they thought might be useful for me, and it was my responsibility to review them. Some of the determining factors, you have to basically find determining factors about your key individuals as soon as you possibly can. Like with Samuel, Native American, so you have to think the region. So then you think about who lives in that region. So then you go towards books of the predominant tribes in the area, and then you can narrow it down from there based on the territory, whose tribes kind of intersected in that area. Frank Bernard, he was more well documented. He's actually listed in the book about Bakersfield. It's actually on the online archives website, a source that I would highly recommend to any of you guys. It is profoundly comprehensive, massive amounts of sources that are accessible to students. You don't have to pay for them or anything like that. I would completely discourage you guys paying for sources. In fact, I would tell you guys to go to Dr. Livingston for newspaper archives, because he can go through a back way to help you guys access older records of newspaper sources. But to kind of answer your question, you have to be extremely meticulous. Write every single thing down. Take pictures of the documents. Those pictures, I took them when I was in the Historical Research Center, then I scanned them and I uploaded them. And you also should be more than comfortable to use pictures in your paper. I would say write the paper first so that you have the amount of pages or words that you need, and then incorporate the pictures. But don't be afraid to use them. They are so helpful, and they really paint a picture of the story you're trying to create. Thank you for the question, by the way.
Anyone else?
Kind of related. If you were to rate the difficulty of how hard a paper was out of 10,
Yeah, I have 1 through 10. I'd say maybe an 8, just because you're balancing everything else of the semester, and that this is kind of like a Herculean task, where you have to write this on top of the semester I wrote this. I was reading books and writing book reviews and other papers, so it was a lot to research this and comb through sources and write this all the while doing everything else. But for me personally, the writing aspect, and I can write papers super easily, so writing this wasn't too terrible, but finding the time to do it and do this justice is what was increasingly difficult.
I would say also an 8, but what professors tend to do is they break up all the assignments you have to do. So they'll first off have you think of a topic and then a research question and then answer that research question. So they make it a lot easier for you to break it down and then go from there.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. My professor, Dr. Moyer, she streamlines the process and made it so much easier. She had one-on-one meetings with us. She helps steer us in directions. She helps me narrow down my focus, because obviously I mentioned there's a lot of stuff happening in the world around this case that may have had some effect on it, but I can't talk about it all at length. I can only mention what I feel was the most important to the case, and professors are extremely helpful in that process. So I would say about an 8 still, but
Okay, we might have time for one more. We have 1 minute left. Anybody else curious about the process? The amount of time involved? Yep, Brian?
For all of you, how long would you say your research took? Just from start to beginning, how many months or days?
Probably the whole semester. Quite frankly, you'll be asked to come up with a research question or a topic and start finding some sources, and from that point onward, you're doing this. So I'd say it's certainly an entire semester.
It's hard to break it down to specific hours or day amounts, but you are working on it, especially in historical writing. That's the whole point, is to write a large research paper at the end. You begin the first couple of weeks.
yeah, it's actually, I would say it's more difficult to determine when your research process should stop, because you can only go back and look at this paper. I kind of did that yourself, I would say at least 3 weeks to write the paper, the actual paper, because you need to go back and edit that paper. You're not gonna get it perfect on the first time. Even with the extensive amount of writing we'll be doing with outlines and drafts and stuff like that, you should also have it peer reviewed, so it's a forever eternal process.
Speaking of the end of time, we are out of time, but thank our guests, please.